Okay, good evening, everyone. Thanks for taking time to join us for this webinar. My name is Willem Koops. I am working for Zuivel NL, a Dutch organization for the Dutch dairy sector. Our tonight's webinar is about the use of recycled manure solids as bedding material for dairy cows. And our presenter today is Andrew Bradley, an expert from the UK. Oh, now I start. My name is Willem Koops. I'm going to present this webinar, chair this webinar, which will be presented by Andrew Bradley. I am working for Dairy NL, a Dutch dairy organization. This webinar is about recycled manure solids using as bedding for dairy cows. The presenter, Andrew Bradley, is an expert. He is founder and director of QMMS, Quality Milk Management Service in the UK. He's also professor of dairy health and production at the University of Nottingham, but he's an expert on this issue because he was project leader of studies about this issue, about the risks, benefits, and optimal management of recycled manure solids. But before we start with the webinar, some background information. This webinar is being delivered by Eurodairy. This is an international network aims to exchange and disseminate knowledge and innovation between farmers in Europe. You can find more about Eurodairy by visiting our website at www.eurodairy.eu. Also, I would like to mention that this webinar will be recorded, so it will be available to watch back on the Eurodairy website. There you can also see other websites which are recorded. Tonight's webinar has more than 50 registrations from dairy farmers, from vets to students and advisors, and it's also from people from different countries. One short remark for the end. You will all stay muted throughout the webinar, but if anyone would like to ask questions, then please type the question into the box on your screen. At the end, we will ask the questions to Andrew. So this was the introduction. Now it's time for our presentation. So Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Willem, and welcome everybody. And thank you to Eurodairy for giving me the opportunity to discuss recycled manure solids and some of our research that we've conducted here in the UK. So what I propose to do over the next 35 to 40 minutes is firstly to consider some of the background to the use of recycled manure solids or green bedding as it's also known, to consider current regulation, but particularly to share with you the findings of our research here in the UK into both the risks and benefits of the use of recycled manure solids and how that's then been formulated into best practice and guidelines that are available for farmers to use here in the UK. So what is green bedding? What are recycled manure solids? These are essentially the solid fraction of separated slurry. And what we're extracting is the undigested fiber to use as bedding material for typically dairy cattle, but also for other cattle. And typically we're aiming for a finished product with a dry matter in excess of 35% at the time of preparation. If we think about the current regulation, then the use of recycled manure solids is actually regulated within the EU because it's considered a category 2 animal byproduct under EU regulations, and therefore its use is technically permitted, but implementation and regulation of its use is actually delegated to the local competent authority locally within the country. So for instance, within the UK, that would be to DEFRA. As a consequence, there's some difference in regulation across the EU, but to focus on perhaps the Netherlands and the UK, then use is permitted. But if we consider the UK, it's allowed within GB, Great Britain, England, Wales and Scotland, but it's not currently allowed in Northern Ireland. Where its use is allowed, again here, for instance, in the Netherlands and the UK, then no composting is allowed. So the product's not allowed to be composted. and that's something we'll touch on a little later. I think probably also relevant is where use is allowed, there are often then retailer or milk processor conditions that are put in place that may add to the local regulations applied by the competent authority. And there may be some retailers that, for instance, here in the UK, do not allow the use of recycled manure solids by farmers that actually provide milk to their pools. So what are the potential benefits? Why use RMS? It's actually an area that came to our interest as researchers at the University of Nottingham and QMMS when AHDB here in the UK were being approached by farmers that were using this material for bedding and lauding some of its benefits. And we conducted initially a scoping study where we actually looked at the use of recycled manure solids. And one of the things we did in that scoping study was to ask the 40 or 50 farmers that had already adopted the technology in the UK what they perceived as being the benefits of the use of recycled manure solids as bedding. And here on this graph, we can see that actually some 60% of users reported that the cows were cleaner when using recycled manure solids as bedding. Around 50% were motivated by a cost saving, which we'll also look at. It was also reported and perceived to be of greater cow comfort, often because the material was perceived as free, didn't have to be purchased, but was produced on farm, that it was used more liberally. So larger amounts were used for bedding, which added to cow comfort. Other benefits that were quoted were actually reducing dust, giving a use for slurry, and also having bedding readily available, which particularly in years such as this, when we've had a challenging summer, can become a problem on some farms. So those are some of the possible benefits. What about some of the risks? Well, there are and there were concerns at the time that we undertook the scoping study of the potential impact of the use of recycled manure solids on animal health and potentially on human health. Human health both directly with the operators on the farm, but indirectly potentially through the food chain, and therefore the impact on food and potentially milk quality. And it was really as a result of some of these concerns about use, but also a desire for better understanding of the benefits of recycled manure solids that we undertook studies here in the UK, initially funded by AHDB, but later by the Welsh government, to better understand the potential for the use of recycled manure solids as bedding. So we initially conducted a scoping study where we actually collated current knowledge. There was a lot of existing knowledge from the Netherlands that we'd like to acknowledge, but particularly to see what was currently understood, but importantly to identify gaps in knowledge. And those gaps were then used to inform a follow-up study, which was funded by the Welsh government, to look at the risks, benefits, and optimal management of recycled manure solids as a bedding material for dairy cattle. And the aim was that that should supplement existing research that had already been undertaken in the Netherlands. And what I intend to do in the rest of my presentation is share to you the findings of those two studies, which then led on into the guidelines for use that are presently in place here in the UK. So firstly, if we consider the study overview, rather than the scoping study, the study that was undertaken to try and fill the gaps, or some of the gaps that we identified in the original scoping study. And in terms of what was conducted in this study, we undertook an epidemiological survey of 125 farms using either recycled manure solids, sawdust, or sand as bedding materials. We also undertook a controlled study looking at different bedding materials and different bedding depths on one farm that we'll look at in more detail. We undertook some computer or in silico modeling to predict the likely levels of MAP or Johne's organism and salmonella in slurry and RMS bedding to try and understand that if there were any risks likely to be associated with recycling of manure and perhaps perpetuating and increasing numbers of these organisms in bedding. We were also tasked with developing an economic cost calculator to try and help farmers make the decision as to whether or not this could be a cost beneficial approach for them. And also to start rolling a study to look at and assess any potential implications for accumulation of antimicrobial resistance on farm as a result of recycling manure in a closed system. And what I propose to do is not to cover all aspects of this study, but some of the key aspects and how they then feed on into best practice guidelines. So if we start with one of the first aims of the study, that was actually to assess the presence, absence, or presence, and also the levels of certain pathogens and milk spoilage bacteria in cubicles that were bedded with RMS, but not just to look at what was happening when we were using recycled manure solids, but actually to compare how those levels were in existing bedding materials such as sand and sawdust, because that was felt to be important, that it wasn't just about knowing the absolute levels present in recycled manure, but actually was this different from the challenge that cows might be faced with from other bedding materials that we often use without an in-depth knowledge of the impact of their use. We conducted this initially through a farm survey through the 125 farms that I mentioned earlier, 40 farms using recycled manure solids, 41 bedding on sand, and 44 with sawdust, all in cubicles. We chose sand and sawdust as our control materials, sand because it's inorganic, commonly used, and sawdust as an organic bedding material. We chose sawdust rather than straw for the practicalities of actually having comparable measures of bacterial numbers in bedding in terms of the material, handling the material, and getting comparable counts. A farm visit was conducted primarily by members of the dairy group that collaborated in this project, where they went through a questionnaire on bedding and bedding management, but also collected samples of bedding and bulk milk, which were then actually shipped back to QMMS, our lab in Somerset, for analysis. And they also undertook collation of udder health data, collecting milk recording, dairy herd improvement information from farms that milk recorded, but also data about clinical mastitis, so we could assess any impact on udder health. In terms of the counts, we looked at total viable counts, the total bacterial count in different bedding materials, coliform counts, streptococcus species counts, staphylococcus counts, counts of thermoduric bacteria and thermophilic spores because of potential concerns that they may survive pasteurization and impact keeping quality of milk, and really extending from work in the Netherlands that had suggested that certain beddings could result in higher numbers of thermoduric spores and heat-resistant spores in milk, and to further understand and try and understand that interaction. And that underlies the reason why compost's not allowed in the UK or the Netherlands. We also looked at the numbers of psychotrophic bacteria, those organisms that can grow at low temperature. And then we selected certain key organisms that could be a cause of food poisoning that you might find in bedding material. Bacillus cereus, Yersinia androcholitica, both as causes of enteritis, also similarly Salmonella species, and finally Listeria species. I think the first thing we should call into mind here is a wealth of data, and I can't present all of it here this evening, but what I think is key and important to remember when we think about the bacterial numbers we saw in the bedding is that we need to interpret that in the light of bedding frequency. So for instance, here, if we look in this table with recycled manure solids, that was typically being added to the bedding either daily on 16 farms or less than daily, but 2 or 3 times a week typically on those farms. In comparison, sand was typically only being added a couple of times a week, maybe even less than once a week on some farms. And sawdust actually on the majority of farms was being added at least daily, if not more often. So we've got a very different time exposure of these different bedding materials, different management techniques that we need to take into account when we interpret the bacterial numbers that we find. I can probably summarize overall, and you wouldn't be surprised to hear that the bacterial numbers were highest in recycled manure solids, with one exception, which was Streptococcus species, that actually were highest in sawdust, which I think is quite surprising when we consider that the majority of farms were putting fresh sawdust on the beds at least daily, and yet there were still very high Streptococcus species counts. I think the other thing, and probably one of our biggest take-home messages from the study, was that we saw more variation within than between the different bedding groups. So we saw more variation in the bacterial counts within sawdust than we did between sawdust and sand, for instance, and that'll be evident as we run through a few slides and a few examples. So I'm not going to go particularly into detail in the numbers of counts, and I'm going to put up a few graphs really for illustration so you can see the variation that we saw in the distribution of the farms. So here we can see the TBC in bedding overall. The numbers are here, but more than the numbers, I want to focus on the distribution. The recycled manure solids are represented by the green bars, each farm. The yellow bars are sawdust farms, and the blue bars are the sand farms. And what we can see here with the TBCs is that they tended to be higher in the recycled manure solids. They were significantly higher in recycled manure solids than they were, for instance, in sand or sawdust beds. If we look at the coliforms, we see a very similar distribution. The counts were again significantly higher in the recycled manure solids, significantly higher than in the sand. The coliform counts were lowest on the sawdust-based beds. But interestingly, the highest coliform count was actually on a sawdust farm. So illustrating that we see more variation within a bedding material than we do between the bedding materials. And finally, if we look at the Streptococcus species, then actually again we see here significant differences, with actually no difference between sawdust and recycled manure solids, but actually significantly higher levels, significantly lower levels in sand. Again, I think we should put this into context. Sand going in once a week or once every 2 weeks, sawdust going in typically at least daily. If we move on to consider some of the organisms that are potential causes of food poisoning, then here we see Bacillus cereus can cause enteritis in humans. And actually we can see here that the counts were significantly and actually many logs higher in recycled manure solids than they actually were in either of the other bedding materials, and in some instances reaching very high levels. Rather than counts, we actually looked for the presence or absence of Yersinia, Salmonella, or Listeria in the different bedding materials. And here we did find significant differences, but only with Listeria. And interestingly, perhaps not unsurprisingly, given that sand and Listeria is often a soil-based organism, we saw significantly higher levels of Listeria, or significantly higher proportion of sand beds being positive to Listeria compared to sawdust or recycled manure solids. So we demonstrated in that first study aim that there was significant differences between the different bedding materials. Counts were typically, but not exclusively, higher in recycled manure solids. But importantly, there was more variation between the different between the bedding materials and within bedding materials than between them. So sawdust could be managed with very low counts, but in the case of poor management, might have very high counts. Now, arguably, the numbers of bacteria in the bedding is slightly academic. What we're perhaps more interested in is what impact might that have on health. Because how, for instance, sand interacts with a cow will be very different from how sawdust or recycled manure solids may interact with the cow or with the teat and the udder. So we went on in the second part of the study to actually assess the transfer of these pathogens present in the bedding into bulk milk, and then the impact of potentially mitigating factors, such as pre-milking teat preparation. And what I've got here is not for all of the pathogen groups we looked at, but actually, again, for a few of the key pathogens, to look at the distributions of the different bedding materials, the different farms on the different bedding materials, and the counts. And what we have in these next series of graphs, in the top right-hand corner, you have the distribution in bedding, and the main graph is the distribution of counts in milk. And I think the take-home message here is that whilst in bedding with TBCs, we have a clear right shift, with the counts being typically higher in the recycled manure solids farms, we don't see that reflected in the milk. And actually, the lowest TBC was actually on a herd bedding on sand. The second lowest was in a herd bedding on recycled manure solids. The highest count happened to be on a herd bedding on recycled manure solids, but the next, or three of the 5 highest TBCs were actually on herds bedding on sand. So there's no clear relationship here between the numbers of bacteria on the bed and the number of bacteria present in milk. And we see that for the TBC. We see the same pattern with the coliforms. The green, the RMS bedded farms to the right in terms of counts on bedding material, but then distributed evenly throughout the different farms, throughout the coliform counts in milk. And again, here we see no significant difference. So with the TBCs, no significant difference in the counts in milks between the different bedding materials, no significant difference in the coliform counts or in the Bacillus cereus. So here, if you remember back to the Bacillus cereus counts in bedding, very, very high, extremely high counts on some recycled manure solids bedded farms, but that didn't translate into the presence of Bacillus cereus in milk. So there were things obviously being done on farm to break that link between bacterial numbers in bedding and bacterial numbers in bulk milk. When we looked at the other food poisoning organisms, so Yersinia, Salmonella, and Listeria, if you remember with Listeria, we had significantly higher proportion of bedding materials actually culture positive for Listeria in sand, but actually the lowest number of herds positive for Listeria in milk was in the herds that were actually bedded on sand. So again, a break in the chain between what's in the bed and what's in the milk. And I think that's quite crucial. As part of this study as well, we were tasked not just to look at the counts of bacteria in the different bedding materials, but with the recycled manure solids under different bedding regimes. And we separated the farms into those that were bedding using RMS in a deep bed and those that were bedding on shallow beds, applying the recycled manure solids as they would perhaps sawdust on top of mats. And when we looked here, we did find differences. We found, for instance, that the TBCs were the total bacterial counts was significantly higher on the farms bedding with just shallow levels of RMS as opposed to deep beds. But on the deep beds, we saw significantly higher levels of Bacillus cereus, which is not unsurprising given to the anaerobic conditions that are likely to be present in a deep bed compared to a shallow bed. When we looked at the relationship between TBCs in bedding and milk on the RMS farms, then we did find a correlation and a significant correlation between the counts of, or the total bacterial count in bedding and the total bacterial count in milk. So when we looked within a bedding material, we could see a relationship between increasing bacterial numbers in bedding and increasing bacterial numbers in milk. So whilst there was no significant effect and no significant difference between beddings, there was within beddings, which again is perhaps not unsurprising given that we're looking at a material of a similar nature applying, sticking to teats or contaminating cow skin in a similar way. And therefore, when within a material you had the higher levels and higher counts, you might expect that with similar management practices to transfer on into milk. The next area that we wanted to look into in detail was actually to try and get some better evidence about any link between the use of recycled manure solids as bedding and udder health in dairy cows, because that was an area that came out particularly of concern, an area that's been studied in various parts of the world, but not in a great deal of detail within Europe. And we did this in a couple of ways, by first looking at data from the farm survey, but also by undertaking a controlled trial at Sue Boren's farm up near Carlisle in collaboration with the Paragon Vet Group and XL Vets. So firstly, if we look at the survey, we collated data and looked at bulk milk somatic cell counts. And here's a graph presented in a similar way as we'd seen with the bacterial counts in bedding and the bacterial counts in milk. And what's quite clear here again is that there's no relationship between bulk milk somatic cell count and bedding material. We've got each of the different types of farms clearly distributed here through the different groups. There was a trend towards bulk milk somatic cell counts being lower in sawdust bedded farms, but that was only a trend. And here, if we look, 4 of the highest bulk milk somatic cell count farms were bedding on recycled manure solids, but 3 of the 5 lowest cell count farms were bedded on recycled manure solids. So there's no given, there's no link between the use of recycled manure solids and increased bulk milk somatic cell count. We also, using the HI records, milk records, actually looked at the rate at which cows were acquiring infection during lactation. And here again, we found no relationship. So we could see no higher rate of new infection as measured by somatic cell count between the different bedding materials, and no difference in the proportion of cows that were actually defined as being chronically infected. So acquiring a new infection and that infection persisting. So again here, no clear links between udder health and bedding material. Finally, we looked at clinical mastitis, and clinical mastitis in the lactating period from 30 days in milk thereafter. And again here, no clear evidence of a link between the rates of clinical mastitis and bedding material that was used. Some clustering here wasn't significant of recycled manure solids farms, and something I'll come back to in a moment when we consider the controlled trial at Sue Boren's farm. The other way we could look at the data is, rather than taking a snapshot and looking in time, would be to say, well, how did these farms perform from when they changed from one year to another, from one bedding material to another? Had we seen any change? And again here, we couldn't see any significant or any trend for any change associated with a change in bedding material between before and after use and switch towards the use of recycled manure solids. So again, no clear link here with udder health. So that was the survey, the epidemiological survey. What perhaps would give us stronger evidence would be to undertake a controlled trial. So in parallel with the epidemiological survey, we undertook a controlled trial at Newton Rig College, where we went into and adapted a cubicle shed that had allowed us to create 4 groups of 40 cows. We randomized the 160 cows to those 4 groups, and then we rotated those groups in 2-week blocks around the 4 different bedding treatments, I've called them here. So they would spend 2 weeks on deep recycled manure solids, then move into another part of the shed to be on shallow recycled manure solids, and then onto deep sand, and then onto shallow sawdust. And the different groups moved around these bedding materials in different ways to allow for any confounding effect of being on a bedding material in a certain order. and we rotated the cows randomly around these blocks for 2 cycles. In terms of management of the bedding material, then the recycled manure solids was refreshed twice weekly, the shallow sawdust twice daily, whereas the deep sand was only replenished once in each cycle, once every 2 weeks. So again here, important to remember, we've got very different bedding managements, very different labor inputs into the different bedding materials. So we then sampled the fresh and used bedding from these cubicles on a fortnightly basis every 2 weeks. We sampled bulk milk weekly using a device to allow us to collect a proportional sample from each of those 40 cow blocks. And we did quarter somatic cell counting every 2 weeks as cows moved from one treatment group or one bedding treatment to another, so that we could define rates of new infection by movements of somatic cell count around the 100,000 cell count threshold. We monitored clinical mastitis, and then when we looked at the effects, we took into account the impact of exposure to the previous bedding material. Because of course a cow could be exposed to recycled manure solids, then go on to sawdust, develop mastitis 2 days later, but that could have been as a result of exposure to the RMS, not the current bedding material. So when we looked at the impact on the proportion of quarters acquiring a new infection, then actually we found the lowest rates were actually when cows were on the shallow sawdust beds. And they were significantly lower than the rates of new infection as measured by somatic cell count on the deep sand bed and the deep recycled manure solid beds. And the shallow recycled manure were actually beds were actually intermediate between those 2 other groups. But again, here I'd like to stress, remember, recycled manure solids bedded twice a week, sawdust twice a day, sand once every 2 weeks. When we looked at the rates within any 2-week block, we saw a very similar pattern, but we didn't see any significant difference. So whilst the proportion of animals becoming infected throughout the whole study period, and when they became infected, tended to be lower on the sawdust-based groups, when we looked within any 2-week block, we didn't see any difference in the rate. We also looked at clinical mastitis, and here what we did see was a trend. There weren't many cases, but there was a trend for cows bedded on recycled manure solids to be at higher risk of developing clinical mastitis than cows not bedded on the recycled manure solids. Only 9 cases of clinical mastitis in the whole 16-week study period, but there was a trend for more mastitis. And I think importantly, and this had been reported anecdotally, a trend for more Klebsiella mastitis in those cows on the recycled manure solids. So another aim was actually to try and understand the different ways that we might mitigate the influence of recycled manure solids. How is it that farmers prevent the transfer of very high bacterial numbers in bedding into milk? And when we looked at management factors, then with the exception of the use of RMS on deep or shallow beds, where bacterial numbers were typically highest, total bacterial counts highest on the shallow beds, we found no consistent effect on bacterial levels in RMS bedding. So we looked at the impact of using a conditioner. That had no significant effect. We looked at bedding frequency. That had no significant effect. The only factor that appeared to affect the total numbers present was whether or not deep or shallow beds were used. When we looked at the impact of bedding on bulk milk, then when we looked across all the bedding types, we could see no obvious correlations. When we looked at foremilking, then that was typically associated with a lower total bacterial count in milk, which you perhaps expect because it reflects perhaps better and more fastidious teat cleaning pre-milking. And we found that pre-milking teat disinfection was associated with lower Streptococcus species count. So foremilking, removing foremilk, lowered TBCs, pre-milking teat disinfection, reduced Streptococcus counts. Automatic cluster disinfection was associated with lower thermophilic and psychotrophic counts, but not lower counts with any of the other organisms. Interestingly, when we looked within RMS, we did actually find some cell count effects. And this is perhaps associated with the fact that we see more Klebsiella mastitis in RMS farms, and that can be associated with persistent infection. We can see that pre-dipping was associated with significantly lower bulk milk somatic cell counts within RMS farms, which suggests that perhaps removing some of those environmental organisms, which are commonly Klebsiella when bedding on recycled manure solids, may be beneficial to udder health. We're also tasked with looking at welfare and comfort, looking at potential benefits in terms of welfare and comfort. And we did this using the survey data and also the controlled trial. Difficult to do in a single sort of one-off snapshot visit to a farm, but we did actually look at cleanliness of both the lower leg, the udder, and the flank. And what we found is that RMS tended to outperform sand and sawdust, or sorry, RMS and sand tended to outperform sawdust in terms of cleanliness. And there was a clear benefit of using recycled manure solids as a bedding material on mats compared to sawdust in terms of cow cleanliness. When we looked at hock swellings and hair loss and hock lesions, again, difficult to assess this on a one-off visit, an observational part of the survey, but sand tended to outperform the other beddings in terms of there was less hock swelling, less hair loss and hock lesions present on farms that were bedding on sand. But again, a clear advantage of recycled manure solids over sawdust on the shallow beds. So there appear to be, in terms of cow cleanliness and cow comfort, some significant benefits of the use of recycled manure solids. In the controlled trial, then actually there was evidence of an increased lying on the deep beds, whether that's recycled manure solids or sand. And there is further data analysis ongoing looking at mobility and lying on the different beds, and that's currently ongoing. We also, because actually very difficult to measure levels of MAP in milk and salmonella, because we wouldn't expect high levels of exposure and we need a very large study to collate useful information on this, we undertook some modeling, some computer-based modeling to try and understand the levels of MAP, Johne's disease, and salmonella organisms we might find in recycled manure solids. I'm not going to go into details of these models, but this is just to illustrate how we took into account liquid removal, the fact that more bacteria would leave with the liquid, addition of new liquid, death of the organisms over time, to model how that might have an effect in different herds according to different underlying levels of Johne's disease within those herds. And what was evident from this is that actually levels would not tend to accumulate. In fact, they would be highest at the start of recycling manure and then would rapidly reach a plateau. And when we actually looked at this to calculate the infective dose from the information that is available, then the infective dose of bedding for a calf of recycled manure solids was going to be of the order of 100 to 1,000 grams. So relatively safe in terms of exposure of adult cattle. Salmonella was a slightly different story. We considered similar cycling recycling, considered then different levels and models of exposure and outbreaks. And what was evident here is that if we had a large herd outbreak with significant shedders present within the herd, you could quite rapidly, under certain scenarios, reach a situation where the infective dose to a human or another cow within the herd would be less than 1 gram of bedding material. So there would appear to be potential for salmonella to accumulate quite quickly and to become an issue on farms using recycled manure. We were also tasked, and it's a difficult area to study, and really we've only started this process, was to consider whether or not there may be any implications for antimicrobial resistance through the use of recycled manure solids. And the concern here was that actually by having a closed loop of recycling of bedding, where the same feces go back into a reception pit, are recycled, put back on bedding, and we have a controlled loop, that there might be potential to perpetuate antimicrobial resistance over time. So what we did as part of the survey was actually collect isolates of coliforms and enterococci in particular to get a baseline level of antimicrobial resistance on these farms. That was collated, and we looked at the data for a number of different antimicrobials for coliforms and enterococci. And what we found in that initial part, that initial survey, is that the MICs vary between farms using the different bedding materials, that there appears to be some relationship between the inhibitory concentrations needed to control the bugs, the MICs for these bugs on different farms, but there was no clear relationship between bedding types. So MICs might be highest for some antimicrobials on recycled manure solids on some farms, but higher on other farms that are bedded on sand. This led to us initiating a longer term study. We undertook 18 months or so ago now a 2-year follow-up. And in that 2-year follow-up, we found that the MICs had changed, but there was no clear association with the bedding type. We looked at costs and the dairy group developed a cost calculator to determine whether or not the use of recycled manure solids would be economically beneficial for a farm to use. And actually what came out here quite clearly is that the use was really favored on larger units. And typically for it to become economically beneficial, you need to be looking at unit size of around 200 cows in the UK market. So that's a very rapid run through of the research that we undertook in the UK. And what I'd like to do now in the last 5 minutes or so is quickly run through how that fed into guidelines and conditions for use in the UK, and then open things up to questions, because I'm sure there may be questions around the guidelines that are currently in place in the UK. So there are conditions for use of recycled manure solids in the UK. They have been developed on the back of our research and put out by the APHA, the Animal Plant Health Agency, acting on behalf and feeding information into DEFRA in England to the Welsh government and the Scottish government that permit the use of RMS in the UK based on certain conditions. One of those conditions is that a producer has to notify the APHA and Red Tractor, one of our food standards or our food standards body, that they are actually utilizing recycled manure solids, and inspection and audit is undertaken by Red Tractor through the assured food standards. So these guidelines are summarized. There are, I think, 18 or 19. I'm saying guidelines, these are conditions for use. So if a farmer is using recycled manure solids in the UK, he must only be using raw cattle manure and slurry. So he must only be taking slurry from on this farm, because it has to be in the same epidemiological unit to be recycled and used on this farm. He mustn't be taking other materials from the farm and extracting from that in addition. He has to be using a separator that's designed for purpose and that actually can produce manure solids with at least 34% solids. The material is not allowed to be composted or digested. So digestate, the use of digestate and the use of composted manure solids is not allowed in the UK because of the concern how that may feed through into milk quality, but with digestate, lack of control over what products are going into the digester. Use has to cease if there's a notifiable disease on farm. And if there's a TB breakdown on farm, then TB inconclusive reactors and reactors must be excluded from any recycled manure solids before they're removed from farm. If there are clinical signs of of enteric disease on farm, salmonella, etc., then again, recycled manure solids use has to be suspended and mustn't continue because of the potential impact that was illustrated from the modeling. Any manure coming from cattle under treatment shouldn't go into the pit for recycling, again, because of the concern over antimicrobial resistance. And similarly, any animals in quarantine pens or any animals that have aborted, material shouldn't be going through, birthing fluids, placental material, etc., should not be going into the pit for recycling. Same with waste milk, again, because of concern of other organisms, potential pathogens, and perpetuating antimicrobial resistance. The product's not allowed to be used in animals or used for bedding animals less than 12 months old, and can only be used in cubicle beds in the UK. So it mustn't be used in deep beds or in yards. It's actually a requirement that any farm using recycled manure solids in the UK has to undertake pre-milking teat disinfection, again, to try and break that link between bacterial numbers in bedding and present in milk, and that any milk produced from farms using recycled manure solids must be pasteurized. So they're not allowed to send products for unpasteurized use. Feeding into the quarantining, then actually any animals brought on to farm, the regulations stipulate that their feces should not be added and recycled for 1 month after they come onto the farm. I believe it happens more in the Netherlands. There's very little, if any, sharing of separation equipment in the UK, but if separation equipment is shared, it needs to be thoroughly cleaned and disinfected before moving on to a separate premises. And actually, the same equipment should not be used for processing feeds and handling recycled manure solids on farm. And the final condition is that the ministry needs to be notified. Attached to those conditions, there are also guidelines for best practice. Those stipulate that cow health and welfare should be actively monitored, particularly udder health and yonis, to look at any potential adverse effects. Farm personnel should be aware of potential risks to themselves and the importance of personal hygiene. The RMS should always be prepared under cover so that it maintains the high level of solids. And there's a need to have excellent cubicle and bedding management with frequent material removal to prevent heating in the beds. Ventilation is key to minimize the risk of dampness, to keep drying and to keep the beds dry. And again, a recommended best practice is that no foot bathing solutions should actually be disposed of into the recycling pit, again, because of the potential risk of heavy metals and perpetuating antimicrobial resistance. And importantly, because some of the conditions actually revolve around stopping use, it's important that a contingency plan is in place so a farm using recycled manure solids can actually quickly revert to another bedding material if required. Okay, that's a lot of material covered, folks. I realize it's a lot to get through in 40 minutes or so. I'd just like to acknowledge other members of the research team that took part in the work we undertook, particularly Catherine, James and Barbara at the lab at QMMS, Martin Green and Jake Thompson at the University of Nottingham, the team at the Dairy Group, particularly Ian Onstadt, Brian Pockney and Tim McKendrick, and David Black at Paragon Vet Group. The manufacturers of the separation equipment that have been very cooperative with the research have undertaken. Shouldn't forget the farmers who allowed us to go on sample and collect samples on farm, and then the vets, researchers and advisors that also helped us collate the data that we've achieved and got together for these studies. Thank you.
Okay, Andrew, thank you very much for your presentation. It was, I think, a very good presentation with a lot of information, but yeah, as always, new developments, we have to do research about what are the consequences, and I think you made it very clear. As I said before, people of listeners can ask questions using the chat box at the right, so I hope questions will come in. Waiting for the first question, maybe I could ask you, I think one of the guidelines, you said something about raw cattle manure must be used. What do you mean with raw? Does it do you have to use it within, let's say, a couple of hours after it's separated, or what's the meaning of raw cattle manure?
So I think that will relates to the slurry that's being collected. Is that what should be separated is just slurry. That we shouldn't be taking slurry that's been stored for protracted lengths of time. We should be separating fresh slurry and using that fresh and quickly on farm or onto the beds. But also there shouldn't be other extraneous materials present in that slurry, which comes into the guidelines. We shouldn't be having, for instance, parlor washings, waste milk, foot bathing materials actually going into the receptacle, which can be tempting because they add fluid. And one of the challenges of making good recycled manure solids is having the right mix, having a high enough fluid content in the slurry to get effective separation. But what the farmer shouldn't be doing is actually adding, for instance, parlor washings or waste milk or other materials to that bedding or to that slurry to improve separation. It should really be just water, could be rainwater plus the slurry. It shouldn't contain other materials.
Okay. You made also very clear that we should be very careful with, let's say, waste milk, and those things should not be added. Yep. Okay. I see the first question from Gavin Davis. Is there any knowledge on the effect of increased drying of RMS, improving its quality and reducing the bacterial count, or possibly the converse?
Okay, so I think good question in improved drying. I think we should aim to get the recycled manure solids as dry as possible. We've done a little bit of additional work that I've not presented here this evening, actually looking at not composting, but actually heating of recycled manure solids using Bauer's bedding recovery unit, which actually, yes, uses heat generated within the product to get to quite high temperatures quite rapidly. And that did result in significant reductions in coliform numbers. But I think what we need to remember there, work from Florida has demonstrated that with recycled manure, albeit used slightly differently in the US, actually you can get the coliform counts quite low, but they very rapidly rise again once that bedding is put onto beds, because the material itself probably perpetuates growth, allows rapid growth, and coliforms are brought onto the bed very quickly by the cow from slurry within the passages. So I think, yes, clear benefits associated with drying. The drier the material, the better, but you still need to replace it frequently because the bacterial counts will rise very quickly.
Thank you. I think that answers the question of Gavin. And if Gavin has an additional question, he can let us know. Just a question to the participants. I know that a lot of people from other countries are participating in this webinar. I would like to know more. Maybe is it allowed in your country, or is it used? Maybe you can, besides asking questions, also say something about the use in your country. I maybe have another question. Maybe that's not linked to the research you have done, but I was wondering, is there in the UK also a kind of let's say public discussion about the use of RMS? You know that let's say people not very familiar with dairy farming or NGOs, they could say maybe they could think that cows are lying in their own faces is not a good way. But is there a kind of public discussion in the UK about it?
I think it's a very good point, Willem, and I think that's part of the reason that the research was initially undertaken. Yes, the concerns about milk quality, public health, animal health, but also to do some work to better understand the use of the product and the potential public perception. How should we present this to the public? Because I think to the uneducated user that's not aware of the benefits of the use of the product, it could be seen as being very negative. I think the industry is very aware of that, and we certainly have situations where certain buyers, certain milk processors have taken the decision that they will not allow their farmers to use this as a bedding material. I think that is going to be on the basis of public perception rather than any perceived animal or human health issues. Because, okay, you could argue this is a relatively new technology still within the UK. Got very few users using the product for more than perhaps 4 or 5 years. We don't know about the longer term benefits or issues associated with use, but I think early indications from the science is that there doesn't need to be any undue risk associated with its use. But public perception will always be something that's different. At the moment, it's not on the public agenda.
Yeah, I have the feeling is the same in the Netherlands because for example, when you go into a barn where recycled manure is used and you feel it, the bedding material, when you feel it, then you can understand why the cows are clean and it's not smelling, etc. So it's more the perception than the reality.
Absolutely, and I think that the product's got a lot of distinct benefits. It's separated fiber, and we shouldn't forget, that it's whilst the counts tended to be higher. For instance, with Streptococcus species counts, they were highest in sawdust, and they were no higher in recycled manure solids. And importantly, that doesn't feed through into milk, doesn't feed through into animal health. And you say the material is pretty inert. It's not unpleasant, and if you see the product, then from an educated perspective and an informed perspective, then you can understand the benefits of the use of the product.
Yeah, I have a question of Ronnie Larson. What happens with the RMS when storing it for months, both in airtight storage and open storage? Mostly wondering about salmonella.
Okay, so I think the good questions. It's not actually allowed here in the UK, so the product should be used and then applied to beds fresh. I believe there is some sort of longer term storage that goes on in the Netherlands, but the concern here would be that if it's stored longer term, you have the risk of heating, and that would result in increased numbers of thermoduric and extreme thermophilic bacteria and spore formation. In terms of salmonella, I think the survival of salmonella means that's likely to be less of an issue, because actually if you've got significant heating going on through storage, then that will actually tend to reduce salmonella numbers. That said, very difficult to understand, very difficult to model in the absence of an outbreak. And we know that recycling of manure in other species has been associated with issues with salmonella. So our advice would be not to store, is to separate and use the product fresh here in the UK. And in the situation where you've got either endemic salmonella or you've got a salmonella outbreak, then you should stop use immediately.
I think the guideline in the Netherlands is to use it within 24 hours, something like that. There is another question from Gavin Davis. You mentioned that Dutch state is not allowed. I understand the concern over the control of potential feedstock in the AD facility, but do you think there is a potential for a restricted use based on simple farm-grown crop feedstock and cow slurry under a condition? Or does the AD system add other concerns in terms of bacteria?
So I think the whole digestate thing, I think, is quite interesting. I think there is potential for the use of digestate for bedding. I think the concern and the reason why it's not allowed in the UK, and I think I would support that, and the person that's asked the question has really highlighted that, is potential lack of control of what's going in as the feedstock for the digester. I think if the digester is purely running on homegrown material and slurry, so let's say it's maize being grown on the farm and slurry from the cows that's going into the digester, then I think if you look, and we've only looked at this in the scoping study, then there's really little cause for concern. I think the issue is when there may be household waste, other waste materials that are going into a digester, then really things become beyond our control. And that's the reason why it's not currently allowed in the UK, is because of what might be happening and is not controlled.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. I think looking at the time that we almost finished the webinar, so I would to make an end to it. I would first of all thanks everyone for listening. I think it was a very interesting webinar. For all people who listened, please keep an eye out on the Eurodairy website for future webinars, maybe also of your interest. Of course, a very special thanks to Andrew for taking time to present this webinar. As I mentioned before, this webinar is recorded and will be available to watch back at the Eurodairy website. All of those who have registered for this webinar will receive an email alerting you when it's live on the website. So then you can, if you want, you can watch it back, or you can tell other people to look at it. Last but not least, I want to thank Suan Howardson of AHDB, who made this technical possible, this webinar. So thank you all for listening and have a good night. Bye.